Hi there, welcome to my channel. If this is your first time here, let me explain what this video is about. I'm documenting the composition of my works, and in this particular case, a piano quintet that I'm writing at the moment. In my previous video, I described my idea for the work and showed its structure. If you haven't seen it, you can watch it before this video, but that's not absolutely necessary. The work is called Symphony for Piano Quintet. I explained my reasons for the title in my previous video, and it will have 5 movements. The first is called Portale, which means portal, doorway in Italian. It's a slow movement with a melancholic and nostalgic character, and here you can see the first 2 measures. The movement is divided into 5 sections, a kind of allusion to the number of movements of the piece. Each section presents the same material, but the harmony and other things change. There are 2 basic ideas, an arpeggio texture and a melodic line made up of long notes. Let me show you. If you can read music, you'll be able to see what happens here. There's an ascending arpeggio that is repeated successively by the different instruments. Actually, I call this a twisted arpeggio. I don't know, that name occurred to me one day and it stuck with me. I call it that because it doesn't move in a straight line, but instead progresses in a wavy fashion. Each repetition of the arpeggio begins before the previous one ends. In music, we would use the words canonical imitation or stretto to describe this, but I prefer the term delay effect because that's how I see it. It's like the delay effect used in audio processing or by rock band guitarists. By the way, both the twisted arpeggios and the delay effect appear quite frequently in my music. In the first section, the arpeggio is presented by the piano and the strings act as an echo. It may not be entirely clear where the repetitions are, but if you look closely, the first rep starts on the cello and the second on the viola. When the cello reaches F4, the viola continues its part, and the second violin continues the second repetition right where the viola left off. So there are 3 presentations of the arpeggio, 1 initial and 2 repetitions. There are 2 other important characteristics here, the time signature and the fact that each measure begins with an accented note. 7/4 is a complex time signature, and, given that the mind cannot divide it in half, creates a sense of irregularity. At the same time, the stressed note establishes a regular pattern. Let me show you how this sounds. That was just a small sample. I won't be playing the whole piece here because I don't like doing that, especially with a piece still in the works. In the past, I've uploaded computer mock-ups of my works to YouTube and SoundCloud, but I don't like doing it anymore. Once the piece is performed and I have access to a recording, I'll share it on this channel, and by then you'll know so much about the work that listening to a complete performance will be a very interesting experience. Now, if you're familiar with the music of composer John Adams, I wouldn't blame you for noticing a similarity between this and the beginning of his opera Nixon in China. Yes, there's a certain similarity, but there are also differences. I was probably inspired by his piece, who knows, but I think my idea is different enough to justify keeping it. After all, if composers discarded all ideas that share some resemblance to the music of other composers, they probably wouldn't write anything at all. So, similar is fine. What we want to avoid is strict imitation. Returning to my piece, in measure 5, the first violin enters playing very long notes, doubled by the piano, which only accentuates the beginning of each note. This is the melodic line that I referred to earlier, and one of its main characteristics is that it has no motives. There is no pattern in the succession of notes or in their durations. However, there is a principle in its construction. With a few exceptions, the line consists of the presentation of notes from a particular pitch class set, and no note is repeated until all the others have been used. Let me show you how this sounds. So, The piece is based on the idea of contrasting a texture with a repeating pattern against a succession of notes without any pattern. The resulting effect is that the melodic line appears to float because we cannot relate it to the texture. If you don't know what a pitch glass set is, I suggest you watch my video on set theory, which I posted a few years ago. The link is in the description. In set theory, notes are referred to using numbers 0 through 11, instead of the typical names, so C is 0, C sharp is 1, D is 2, and so on. This particular set is 735, which is none other than the diatonic scale. Yes, you heard right, the diatonic scale. Why on earth would I use the diatonic scale and not call it by that name, but use the term set 735 instead? Well, simple, it's a mental trick. Scales are ordered sequences of notes, usually with hierarchical relationships between them, which are firmly implanted in our mental hearing through years and years of musical conditioning. A set, on the other hand, has no organization. It has no hierarchy. When I look at these notes as set 735, I avoid seeing them as the E-flat major scale, or the C minor scale, or the Ionian mode in E-flat, or any other scale that can be formed with them. And I also avoid thinking about all the typical hierarchical relationships that are established between these notes by tradition. It's a mental trick that helps me to see this harmonic entity devoid of any internal organization, even though my brain will try to constantly organize them in a familiar way, a habit that I struggle with as much as possible, but to no avail sometimes. You may have noticed this little purple callout down here. It's part of Dorico's comment function, and it means that there is a comment attached to this note. If I click on it and open the comment panel, you'll see what the comment says, 735 and the number 2 in parentheses. This means that this section uses set 735 transposed to note 2, which is D. I'll show you the transposition changes in each section and then make an interesting comment about them. We'll get there in a moment. The second section begins at measure 26 and introduces some changes to the music. First, the arpeggio no longer starts on the piano but on the strings, and the piano now functions as an echo of them, so the relationship between them has been reversed. In addition, the melodic line is no longer in a single string instrument but in two, in octaves, the second violin and the viola. There are two other cool things in this section. The first is that it presents the longest note so far, this B flat, which establishes a kind of suspension in the music and therefore generates expectation. The second is that the final measure of this section is larger. Its time signature is 8/4. This is also unexpected and creates a break in the succession of accented downbeats. As Leonard Meyer points out in his book Emotion and Meaning in Music, affect or emotion felt is aroused when an expectation, a tendency to respond, activated by the musical stimulus situation, is temporarily inhibited or permanently blocked. This is what happens here. The expectation of a stressed downbeat is temporarily inhibited. It's only one beat, but it's enough to influence our emotions. On the harmonic side, the set has now been transposed from note 2, D, to 7, G. In other words, raised by a perfect fourth. Let's hear a fragment of this section. The third section presents more changes. First, the arpeggio is now descending and has a counterpart, a different arpeggio that is played underneath and begins an eighth note later. The second change is that the melodic line is on the cello and that it drops to a point where it's even below the accented downbeat of the piano. The set has been transposed to note 0, C, that is raised again by a perfect fourth. Listen to the first measures of this section. Now we come to the fourth section. Here, for the first time, there is no accented downbeat, and the low note is played by the cello instead of the piano. The arpeggios rise again, and their counterpart is now on fourth notes, also on the cello. The melodic line undergoes a great transformation. It's no longer a single line, but a succession of chords on the piano, and since the pitches cannot be sustained by the instrument, the progression requires our memory to be established. But trust me, we are all very good at it. The set is now transposed from note 0 to note 6, F sharp. In other words, raised by an augmented fourth. Let's listen. Finally, in the fifth section, the melodic line, or the succession of chords, is abandoned, and the music consists only of arpeggios, one ascending, the other descending. This continues for 6 bars, with no indication of where the music is going, until at bar 77, a ritardando signals that we are nearing the end of the movement. The set is now transposed to note 5, in other words, it's lowered by a semitone, although it's better understood as having been raised by a major seventh. Now comes the comment that I was going to make about the transpositions of the set. The first 2 raise the pitches by a perfect fourth, thus establishing a pattern, in other words, creating the expectation that the next transposition will do the same. But this doesn't happen because the third transposition changes the pitches by an augmented fourth. So our expectation is deceived, and in Mayer's terms, emotion felt is aroused. The final transposition is a new deception, since it doesn't affirm the new interval, but it expands it to a major seventh. Let's hear a few measures of this final section. So there you have it. That's the first movement, and I think that's all I have to say about it. I hope you found this video interesting. If you do, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to be notified every time I post a new video. Next time, I'll show you the second movement. Until then, take care. Ciao.